Hi, my name is Lynea Murphy, and I am the Global Regulatory Toxicology Leader at Corteva AgriScience. I want to thank the Planning Committee for this opportunity to present some of our research efforts to build the weight of evidence to remove dog as a required species for testing. I also want to acknowledge and thank Cecilia Tan at US EPA for her valuable discussion and expertise on the integration of the data discussed today, as well as overall refinement to the decision tree approach. The title of my presentation is Incorporating Toxicokinetic and Toxicity Data to Evaluate the Value Added from Using Dogs in Subchronic Toxicity Testing for Agrochemicals. This slide is for your information and provides a quick reference guide for key acronyms and abbreviations used throughout this presentation. As part of the core requirements for global agrochemical registration, a 90-day non-rodent toxicity study, typically using the dog, is conducted. As part of this requirement, a rangefinder and tolerability study can be conducted to select dose levels and to determine the short-term toxicity profile. Metabolism data may also be generated in the dog to evaluate TK and also determine the overall metabolism profile. Since 2018, the one-year toxicity study in dogs is no longer a default global testing requirement. In principle, multiple test species increase the likelihood that one of these animal models will provide relevant information to assess potential health effects in humans. However, when we consider the need for non-rodent toxicity testing and the value it provides, we should consider the following: the weight of evidence to evaluate predictivity of the animal model, including endpoints such as TK, toxicity, and proposed mode of action. 3R principles for replacement, refinement, and reduction of animal testing. Technical considerations such as route of administration and tolerability. And also regulatory acceptability and considering the overall need for this study on a case-by-case basis. Within the 3R principles, consideration and commitment to animal welfare principles is first and foremost. Refinements consider the relevant route of administration, and study design improvements have greatly minimized animal use on short-term studies, including removal of control animals, as well as the option of non-terminal endpoint metabolism studies. Our current focus on determination of species sensitivity considers how to build the weight of evidence to replace toxicity testing with alternate approaches, including more routine use of in vitro and in silico methods that can refine the need for multiple species used in vivo testing, along with the comparison of rat and dog TK plus toxicity data as a measure of species sensitivity. When considering traditional toxicity testing and whether the most sensitive species can be identified using the No Observed Adverse Effect Level, or NOAEL approach, the external NOAEL is the following: the highest dose at which no adverse effects have been detected. It's not a biological threshold, and it's a value subjective to dose selection, dose spacing, and sample size. The applied dose can reflect both toxicity and TK sensitivity, yet it doesn't account for species size difference. However, NOAELs can be derived from both TK and toxicity data, which can allow us to distinguish species sensitivity while considering the following points. The NOAEL is still used as a measure of systemic toxicity comparison between species. However, systemic exposure data can also be used to correlate the external NOAEL to the internal NOAEL to provide data on TK sensitivity. In line with 3R efforts to build the weight of evidence so that the dog is not compulsory for agrochemical toxicity testing in the future, we have routinely integrated TK evaluations onto short-term rodent and dog studies, which enables us to evaluate dose proportionality, systemic exposure, and to characterize the relationship between applied versus internal dose. To determine species sensitivity using previously generated TK and toxicity data, a retrospective analysis was conducted using a single case example for a compound identified here as Herbicide A. The intent was to provide some additional information to answer the following question. How would the generated TK and systemic toxicity data have informed selection of the appropriate species for human health risk assessment? The goal was to create a straightforward decision tree shown here, which allowed for integration of the metabolism, TK, and toxicity data to compare species sensitivity based on traditional systemic toxicity endpoints, along with a comparison of systemic exposure. Both data sets were used to form a conclusion for this case example as to the value of adding a 90-day toxicity study in the dog for compound toxicity characterization and human health risk assessment. The available data used in this retrospective analysis are listed here and include single-dose metabolism probe study data for both species, along with repeat dose TK and toxicity data. In addition, in vitro data evaluating unique species metabolism, microsomal clearance, and plasma protein binding were evaluated. The metabolism pathway for Herbicide A includes the parent compound, along with primary metabolite B, which is common to both the rat and dog species. For the herbicide case example, a summary of rat and dog TK and toxicity data revealed the following. There are no observed adverse effects after 90 days of dietary exposure in either species. The NOAEL is 1,000 mg per kilogram per day for both rat and dog. Data from repeat dose TK evaluations, which were collected at the end of a 90-day dietary toxicity study and measured levels of the primary metabolite B, indicate that rat has higher systemic exposure than the dog. Dose normalized data provide a similar trend. Overall, the conclusion is that there is higher systemic exposure to primary metabolite B in the rat. If we integrate the retrospective data analysis into the decision tree, we can support the following weight of evidence. Primary metabolite B is the major metabolite in rat and dog. Urinary elimination was similar between rat and dog, with rat slightly higher. On short-term 28-day studies, as well as 90-day studies, no toxicity was observed for either species. TK data were non-dose proportional for both species, and overall, rats had higher systemic exposure. Based on toxicodynamics as measured by systemic toxicity, rat and dog are equivalent, as there was no observed toxicity for either species. However, the TK data indicate that rat is more sensitive than dog based on higher systemic exposure. For this example, a conclusion can be made that supports the rat as the more conservative and therefore relevant species for human health risk assessment. For phase 2 of this assessment, we wanted to use only in vitro data, so available physical chemistry data including aqueous solubility and log P data, along with in vitro microsomal clearance and plasma protein binding data, were used as data inputs into GastroPlus software to determine if in vitro data alone could provide similar trends for systemic exposure compared to single-dose in vivo metabolism data. This slide provides the outputs for rat and dog from that simulation. The results are plotted with simulation time in hours on the x-axis and plasma concentration expressed as microgram equivalents per milliliter on the y-axis. The rat simulation is on the left, the dog simulation is on the right. The solid line is the simulated plasma time course for a 100 mg per kilogram single dose of Herbicide A. The boxes, which are for comparison, are the experimental data from a metabolism study using the same dose. Based on this comparison, the simulated data have a good fit to the experimental data, and the model predicts that systemic exposure to primary metabolite B is higher in the rat. So how does this simulation compare to our available in vivo data, looking at either single or repeat dose exposure? The following table provides the 24-hour AUC comparison across the simulated data, the single dose in vivo data, and also the 90-day repeat dose data using the 100 milligram per kilogram dose from each data set. The first row shows the GastroPlus predicted plasma AUC for a single dose exposure, which does not distinguish between different sexes. Row 2 is the 24-hour systemic exposure data for both rat and dog, calculated from the single dose metabolism study. And row 3 is the systemic exposure determined during the last week of a 90-day exposure. For each of these scenarios, the rat has higher systemic exposure. The in silico data are consistent with trends observed for experimentally generated data, so this type of approach can serve as an initial assessment of species TK differences. However, as we consider the use of PBTK models in the future for repeat dose exposure simulations, the in vivo data could also be integrated along with the in vitro data for use in PBTK models. To simulate systemic exposure across an entire dose response range for short-term studies, which can provide information to refine study design and dose selection for initial toxicity assessment. We are currently evaluating additional case examples with this type of approach. The goal we are working towards is characterization of species differences in TK or toxicity using in vitro, in silico, and/or short-term toxicity data, which helps to build the weight of evidence for selection of the most sensitive and relevant species for subchronic toxicity evaluation. As we are considering additional refinements and the future of toxicity testing, we also need to consider the evaluation of species-specific mechanisms and whether these are human relevant. A more comprehensive decision tree is proposed here, which considers both the TK and toxicity questions discussed for our case example and uses the WHO IPCS mode of action human relevance framework along with Bradford Hill criteria to evaluate whether the observed TK and toxicity profile in the dog is occurring via dog-specific mechanisms and whether these mechanisms may be human relevant, which ultimately helps determine whether there is a need and added value for conduct of a subchronic toxicity study in the dog. The herbicide case example discussed today is represented in this area on the far left of the decision tree, in which there is no toxicity observed and the rat has higher systemic exposure, indicating a subchronic dog toxicity study is not needed. However, for other scenarios, there are additional questions to consider. For one, what is the predicted systemic exposure profile look like using TK or PBTK modeling? When considering short-term toxicity, is there a similar toxicity profile between rat and dog? Is there toxicity specific to only rat or dog? And finally, if there are observed differences in dog toxicity or systemic exposure, can we determine the mechanism? Are these mechanisms human relevant? Considering these questions can aid in building the weight of evidence to determine whether subchronic dog studies are value added or even necessary. Our preliminary conclusions from our case examples indicate that a decision tree approach using integrated TK and toxicity data can be used for the following: to determine sensitive and relevant species for human health risk assessment, to refine the testing strategy, and to potentially reduce unnecessary use of dogs for agrochemical toxicity testing. As we consider ways in which we can expand the use of toxicokinetic data for future assessments, we can begin to routinely generate in vitro assay data for refinement of PBTK models for repeat dose exposure, And we can continue to work toward the accepted use of validated PBTK models to select the relevant species for human health risk assessments. This concludes my presentation for today. Thank you for your attendance and interest in this topic.